The afternoon sun had a soft golden hue as it slipped through the half-open blinds of my apartment. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, and the faint hum of the city outside seeped through the thin glass. I sat at the edge of the worn sofa, the fabric slightly frayed at the arms, running my fingers along the familiar texture. There was a quietness here, a stillness that felt like a fragile shield against the chaos of life beyond these walls. My apartment had always been my sanctuary, a space where every corner held memories, some tender, some bittersweet. It was on one of these ordinary afternoons that the first ripple of unease appeared. I had just returned from the grocery store, carrying 2 bags heavy with the mundane evidence of everyday life, when I noticed the door ajar. At first, I thought it was careless of me, perhaps I had forgotten to latch it properly. But the cold draft that slipped past the threshold, carrying the faint smell of perfume unfamiliar to my senses, set my heart racing with a quiet alarm. She was there. My daughter-in-law. The young woman I had welcomed into the family with all the civility and courtesy that I could muster, despite the subtle warning bells that never fully ceased in the back of my mind. She stood near the kitchen counter, her eyes scanning the fridge as if it belonged to her. There was no knock, no hesitation. Only the audacious assumption that this space was now hers to enter at will. The first words out of my mouth were measured, calm, the voice steady despite the heat crawling up my neck. "May I help you?" Her head snapped up, surprise flickering for just a moment before a faint, rehearsed smile took its place. "Oh, I thought you wouldn't mind. I needed something." I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral, forcing myself to inhale the cool, artificial scent of the apartment, the faint aroma of cleaning supplies, the lingering trace of tea from the morning. "You should have called." She shrugged lightly, as though the gesture absolved her of any breach. Her presence, casual and unrepentant, nodded something deep within me, a sense of quiet disrespect, a dismissal of boundaries I had always held sacred. Yet I said nothing more, merely guiding her toward the exit with polite words that carried the weight of restrained disapproval. After she left, the apartment seemed to exhale with me, the silence heavy and thick, pressing against my chest. I wandered from room to room, touching surfaces, opening drawers, confirming that nothing had been taken, nothing disturbed. Yet the unease lingered, not in what was missing, but in what had been violated, a sense that the rules of our lives, carefully established over decades, were quietly being rewritten by someone who did not recognize their weight. Days passed. Each visit from her was a calculated intrusion, small enough to evade confrontation, yet insistent enough to fray the edges of my patience. There were moments I caught her lingering near my personal spaces, her fingers brushing the edges of my books, her laughter too loud in rooms meant for calm. The family noticed little, attributing my silence to patience or aging. They did not see the storm that gathered in the quiet corners of my mind. One evening, as twilight spilled a muted lavender over the city, I returned home to find her again in my living room, this time seated on the sofa where I had spent countless hours reading and reflecting. She held a small trinket in her hand, one I had not seen leave my collection, her eyes flickering toward mine with feigned innocence. I said nothing. I only stood there, letting the tension coil silently between us. She met my gaze for a heartbeat, perhaps sensing the unspoken weight of the moment. Then, without a word, she placed the trinket back where it belonged and left as quietly as she had come. The apartment settled into silence once more. Yet I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that this was not the last of it. Something had shifted. The balance of respect, the boundaries I had so carefully maintained, had been tested. And I, in my own quiet way, had begun to consider a response that required neither shouting nor confrontation, but the measured patience of someone who had learned the power of restraint. That night, I sat by the window, watching the city lights blink like distant stars. My thoughts traced the incidents in careful loops, weighing each one, tracing the subtle disrespect that had been hidden beneath politeness and smiles. It was not anger that stirred within me, but clarity, a slow, deliberate understanding that actions carried consequences, and that even silence could be a strategy, a weapon in its own right. And then, as sleep finally tugged at my eyelids, I made a quiet decision. I would move, but not in haste or passion. I would act in the manner of patience and precision, letting the truth find its natural course. And in that decision, I found a small measure of calm. But the thought of what was to come, the slow unraveling of her assumptions, brought a tension I could not shake. I knew the quiet storm had only just begun. Weeks passed with a meticulous rhythm. I rearranged the apartment subtly, storing away valuables, installing discreet locks, and leaving nothing visible that could invite further intrusion. It was a dance of invisibility, every movement calculated, every glance considered. I watched her through the lens of careful observation, noticing the small patterns she left behind, the way she lingered longer in the hallway, the soft creak of the floor beneath her steps when she thought no one could hear. There was a subtle cruelty in her disregard, a sense of entitlement she wore like a second skin. But I did not respond with confrontation. I had learned, over the decades, that quiet persistence often outweighed anger. My strategy was simple: let her assume control, then allow the truth to arrive naturally, as if the universe itself were correcting the imbalance. One rainy afternoon, the apartment smelled of damp concrete and wet earth seeping through the thin cracks in the window frame. The rhythm of the rain against glass was hypnotic, a steady drumbeat that seemed to echo my thoughts. I noticed her lingering in the doorway, her expression caught between hesitation and expectation. She said nothing at first, merely observed, as if testing the waters of my patience. "Is something wrong?" I asked, voice calm but deliberate. She laughed softly, a sound meant to charm, meant to diffuse the tension. "Nothing, really. I just thought I'd stop by." I nodded, allowing the silence to stretch, heavy and purposeful. It was a pause loaded with meaning, a mirror to her own intrusions, a quiet reflection of her assumptions. She shifted uncomfortably, her confidence waning as the weight of my calm scrutiny bore down without a single raised voice. In those weeks, I began documenting photographs, records of her visits, timestamps, everything meticulously noted. Each entry was clinical, devoid of emotion, yet it built a quiet fortress of evidence. I did not share it with anyone. Did not discuss it over calls or family gatherings. It was a private ledger, a testament to my patience, my restraint, and my refusal to be drawn into petty conflict. The emotional weight, however, grew heavier. There were nights I lay awake, hearing the city sigh outside, wondering at the fragility of trust and the audacity of entitlement. My thoughts wandered to my son, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in his own home. I felt the sharp sting of responsibility, not just to protect my space, but to uphold dignity, to ensure that justice, even if delayed, would arrive untainted by emotion or haste. One evening, as the orange glow of sunset bled into the living room, I prepared a small tea, placing it on the side table, the steam curling lazily into the fading light. She appeared in the doorway, smiling, unaware of the undercurrent that had begun to tighten like a slow coil. I poured my words carefully, measured, gentle yet firm. "You know, boundaries exist for a reason," I said softly. "They are not meant to be ignored." Her smile faltered, though she tried to maintain composure. She leaned lightly against the frame of the door, a subtle gesture of defensiveness. I did not advance, did not push. I only let the words settle between us, carrying the weight of calm authority. It was in that moment that I saw it, the tiny cracks in her composure, the recognition that her actions had consequences she had not anticipated. My patience, my deliberate restraint, had shifted the balance subtly but irrevocably. She began to understand, not through fear, but through the quiet accumulation of evidence, through the gentle but unyielding presence of accountability. Then, late one night, the culmination arrived. The apartment was silent save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip of water from the kitchen tap. I had set up the last piece of my plan, a subtle entrapment to allow natural consequence to do its work. The soft click of the lock engaged, the faint echo of a distant siren, the careful alignment of documentation, all of it orchestrated without confrontation, without aggression. I did not need to witness her realization in the heat of the moment. I only knew, with a quiet certainty, that when the authorities arrived, she would confront a truth she had long evaded. And in that quiet, in the stillness of my apartment, I felt the slow release of tension, a cathartic exhale that had been years in preparation. Yet even as I settled into the calm, I understood that this was not the end. There was still the matter of closure, of dignity restored not only to myself but to the subtle moral balance of our lives. And so I waited, patiently, knowing that the final act of justice, measured and restrained, was yet to unfold. The morning was pale and gray, with mist curling along the streets outside. I moved through the apartment with a quiet deliberation. The air cool against my skin, carrying the faint smell of rain-soaked concrete. My heart was steady, my breathing even. Today would mark the end of a chapter written in silence, in restraint, in the careful orchestration of truth. When the knock finally came, it was firm, official, and deliberate. 2 officers stood at the threshold, their presence a reminder that patience and documentation had power beyond argument or emotion. She arrived moments later, unaware of what awaited, her steps faltering as she glanced between the uniformed figures and the apartment she had long assumed was a space she could enter at will. I watched from a distance, remaining calm, letting the scene unfold without interference. There were no screams, no pleading, only the steady unfolding of consequence. Her face paled, eyes widening, as the reality she had long evaded settled like cold water over her. She stammered, tried to protest, but the evidence, my quiet record, meticulous and precise, left no room for denial. It was over quickly, the officers guiding her gently but firmly toward accountability. I felt no triumph, no anger. Only a quiet relief, a sense of dignity restored not through aggression, but through patience, clarity, and the unwavering adherence to principle. Afterward, the apartment was silent, the kind of deep, restorative quiet that carries the weight of resolved tension. I moved from room to room, touching familiar surfaces, breathing in the comfort of personal space reclaimed. The light through the blinds was soft and warm, a golden affirmation that order and respect had returned. I sat at the edge of the sofa, reflecting on the slow, careful journey that had led here. It was a reminder that strength often resides in restraint, that the quiet accumulation of evidence and measured action can achieve justice without cruelty. The lessons were subtle, yet profound. Boundaries matter, dignity is preserved not through confrontation but through clarity, and even the most audacious disrespect can be met with patience and principle. As the day deepened into afternoon, I felt a calm settle over me, a sense of closure that had been decades in the making. My sanctuary, once quietly violated, was now restored. And in the silence, I understood that true power is measured not in force, but in the quiet, deliberate actions that bring balance, accountability, and peace. The apartment exhaled with me, the city humming softly beyond the walls, and I finally allowed myself a small, contented smile. Justice had arrived, not with anger or spectacle, but with the dignity and calm that only patience can cultivate. And in that stillness, I knew the storm had passed, leaving behind only clarity, restoration, and the serene, unshakable calm of a life reclaimed.